What are the plus and minuses?
Okay. Oh, good. More people coming in. That's always good. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Ben.
Oh,
I'm Ben Ridings. I am the coordinator for museum education here for Cape May Mac, and I'm also the registrar of the museum division, as well as the, well, I'm Dr. Physic as well, so you may have seen me there. Yeah, so my face is all over the place. So before I started sharing my screen to my PowerPoint, I just wanted to say hello to everyone, and you can actually see me before we go over there.
I finished.
So this is about
Real
the
quick before we begin,
way that some Christmas stories have
yeah,
shaped the Christmas
some of you do have your mics on, so feel free to mute them. And towards the end, well, at the end, I'll be answering any questions. Now, it can be a little difficult with so many people in this Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a button for chat. So feel free, and again, you can do this towards the end. Feel free to just write any questions you might have in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. With that being said, we can start. Let me just share this. Okay. Come on. Everyone can see my PowerPoint? Yeah, okay, good. So, well, really, I want to start off by thanking you all for joining me today. We weren't sure how this was going to go over Zoom, so I'm glad that we have, upwards of 24 people already joining us for this one. So that's just great. Now, I'm a historian, so before we really jump into Charles Dickens or even Washington Irving, I always like to add some context to what we're talking about. And it's really important to understand the context of the Christmas celebration in the early 1800s. Now we'll start chronologically. So we'll start with Washington Irving. So in the United States, Americans were very much divided about Christmas and how to celebrate it. I mean, in that time period, you essentially had different portions of the country making up America. So you had the New England, you had basically the middle states, the South, and there was the West, which I always laugh about, because when we're talking about the West, we're talking about like Ohio, not much past that. Now, see, up in New England, there was a very Puritan influence going on, and the Puritans, for lack of a better word, absolutely hated the celebration of Christmas. They thought the birth of Jesus, if it was celebrated or was observed, excuse me, should be reverent and solemn. Now, there were other instances in not just New England, but specifically in New England, of people, celebrating to the fullest effect with drunkenness and other sorts of revelry. So you had those two sides kind of knocking heads, if you will, with each other. And even in the section of the country where Christmas was celebrated, it wasn't the holiday that we know of it today. It was very much just a very, very small celebration. I mean, businesses weren't particularly closed. The governments were still open and functioning. So it's very different from what it has become. And the last thing I'll talk about is there was also a movement during the American Revolution to kind of throw off any traditions of England. And I mean, this is not true for everyone, but a section of the population was associated some of the Christmas traditions with England, and we're like, well, we're separated from them, so we don't want to really do any of their traditions. So let's just kind of throw it out and forget about it. So how did this change is the question I'll be answering throughout this lecture. And the first person is Washington Irving. He was born on April 3rd, 1783.
You can't hear it either.
Oh, I'm listening.
What?
Well,
I can't hear it at all.
he was a very important author for the Americans, because really, I mean, he was extremely popular here in the United States, but he was really the first well-recognized popular author over in England and old Europe, those areas.
Yeah.
Now, he was the youngest of 11 children, and I'm sure I don't have to bring up this to many of you, but isn't it interesting, at least in my experience, how the younger kids always seem to get away with the most? That was true then, and because Washington Irving's father, who, by the way, Washington Irving was named after George Washington, his father required all of his other sons to attend college. Washington Irving didn't want to attend college. So guess what? He didn't have to. Talk about, the youngest getting away with things that the oldest had to. Anyway, he wanted to practice law. And as he was studying, he began writing a bit. Especially, he wrote several essays in his family-owned newspaper entitled The Morning Chronicle. And Irving used the name Jonathan Oldstyle Gentleman instead of his own. And that's a reoccurring theme throughout Washington Irving's various novels and writings, that he used a different name other than his own. Now, in 1909, Washington Irving released A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty by Diedrich Knickerbocker. And this really thrust him into popularity. The funniest thing about this is he wrote this book as a parody of a different handbook that was being circulated called A Picture of New York Life. So the Picture of New York Life is very solemn, very serious. And this book that Washington Irving wrote was kind of poking fun at that book itself.
No, I don't think so.
Now, why am I talking about the history of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty? In this book of over 600 pages, there are a few references to someone which Washington Irving calls the patron saint of New Amsterdam, which is New York, and that is Saint Nicholas. And a few of the passages where he describes Saint Nicholas really is the beginning of the character of, as we know today, Santa Claus. I mean, you can really see images that he portrays, which evolved a little bit over time, but
Who's that? I
it's
know.
part of our collective
Yeah.
culture of
It's a
Santa
spring.
Claus. Now, again, in this 600-page book, there were only a few little clippings of it,
I guess she's there.
probably only a
She
dozen
is. I
sentences.
saw her on the name list.
So don't go reading that book thinking it's all going to be about Santa Claus, because you'll be mistaken. But anyway, instead of trying to describe to you what he writes, I'm just going to read to you what he wrote, and you'll be able to pick out some of the imagery that's still used today. Quote, "The sage dreamed a dream, and lo, the good Saint Nicholas came riding over the tops of the trees in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children." Later on, a character gives the sign of Saint Nicholas by laying his finger beside his nose and winking hard with one eye. Irving goes on to write, "At this early period was instituted that pious ceremony, still religiously observed in all our ancient families of the right breed, of hanging up a stocking in the chimney on Saint Nicholas' Eve, which the stocking is always found in the morning miraculously filled, for the good Saint Nicholas has ever been a great giver of gifts, particularly to children. And the last passage I want to read, the good Saint Nicholas would often make his appearance in his beloved city of a holiday afternoon, riding jollily among the treetops over the roofs of the houses, now and then drawing forth magnificent presents from his breeches pockets and dropping them down the chimneys of his favorites. Whereas in these degenerate days of iron and brass, he never shows us the light of his countenance, nor ever visits us, save confining his presence merely to the children. So, quick recap of what we just read. St. Nicholas comes one night a year. He rides his wagon. Okay, it's a wagon. It's not a sleigh yet. It's a covered wagon. That evolves a little bit later on. He comes down the chimney, gives presents, and fills the stockings of children. Now, many of these scenes might sound familiar to you as well because, well, it sounds so similar to Clement Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, or as we know it today, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. It's worth pointing two things about this connection. As I stated before, Irving's book was published in 1809, 14 years before Moore's poem. The other connection is Washington Irving and Clement Moore were actually good friends. So it's very possible that Washington Irving influenced Clement Moore's poem. In fact, just as a little side, as I was doing research for this, apparently there's a big debate going on of whether Clement Moore actually wrote "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." For you see, when it was first published, there was no name attached to it, and the people debating say, well, it has a very solid Dutch influence in its depictions of St. Nicholas. And although Clement Moore wasn't Dutch, Washington Irving very much knew the Dutch culture. So his friendship with Washington Irving is actually a argument of why Clement Moore wrote the poem. Now, during the War of 1812, Washington Irving went to England, or excuse me, after the War of 1812. His family owned a shipping business, and as you can imagine, the war was not very good for the shipping industry. So he went over to England and tried to mend some fences and get the shipping industry going. He spent quite a long time over there. And in 1820, he published a collection of short stories entitled The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Cranien, Gentleman. And this is where Irving's most famous stories come from, including Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and kind of tucked away within this collection are 4 connecting Yuletide stories. Irving biographer Brian J. Jones writes, quote, while several other stories in the sketchbook were better known, none would have a greater impact on American culture than these 4 Christmas essays. Now, just to give you the setting, these essays involved the main character, Geoffrey Cranien, traveling at a public house. He meets an old school friend, Frank Bracebridge. Bracebridge invites Cranien to his father's estate for an old-fashioned English Christmas. And throughout the essays, Irving describes old English traditions from years past. Here's where it's a little interesting, though. Some things he brings up were old English traditions. Others, well, he kind of just made up. But the general public didn't know any different. So when this book came out, people of the American culture really started to reenact these various traditions that were once prevalent in English society. I just want to talk about these 4 essays individually and just kind of pull out parts that you should recognize from Christmas traditions, some of which that are still continued to this day, really can go back to Washington Irving writing this book and it becoming part of American Christmas traditions. So we start with the stagecoach, which is the first essay. Now, the main character, Cranyon, is on this stagecoach with several school-aged boys who are going home for Christmas time. And well, this might sound like a small Christmas tradition in the sense that it was always around, but the boys were very excited about giving their gifts to their family members. And well, there's a wonderful part, and please just indulge me for a few minutes, less than a few minutes, sorry. But when Cranyon and Bracebridge arrive at the estate, there's a wonderful few sentences about how they're greeted. And I just want to read that to you. We were interrupted by the clangor of a troop of dogs of all sorts and sizes. The little dogs and all, Tray, Blanche, and Sweetheart. See, they bark at me, cried Bracebridge, laughing. At the sound of his voice, the bark was changed into a yelp of delight, and in a moment he was surrounded and almost overpowered by the caresses of the faithful animals. And that might seem strange to talk about during this presentation, but it's one example of, I believe one reason this was very popular is because it really played on sentimental feelings. And that's how Washington Irving wrote this. So just as simple as, coming home and being greeted by the family dogs. It's something people can associate with and really get them into the story, so then they can start picking out other things which they're not familiar with. Which we go to our next item, Christmas Eve. Now, this is something I'm sure we're all familiar with, that Washington Irving really explains to his American audience, and that is the mistletoe. He even goes so far as
In our house, but I never got any. For us, we'll have to get some this year.
to put a note at the end of the story. Even going deeper into the mistletoe, he puts, quote, the mistletoe is sticking up in farmhouses and kitchens at Christmas, and the young men have the privilege of kissing the girls under it, plucking each time a berry from the bush. When the berries are all plucked, the privilege ceases. So that's another aspect. Well, with artificial mistletoe, nobody's really picking the artificial berries. So that's something that's a little bit fallen out of favor with in that respect. But Irving also addresses another Christmas tradition, and I find this one quite funny because it seems to have a resurgence, I would say maybe the last 10 years, but not in the way which Washington Irving wrote. If you go online, there are various apps and videos which can light up our screens for hours. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Yule log. Washington Irving explains this to the readers. And yeah, I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, nobody really heard of Yule log, but all of a sudden, now you can, get a 3-hour video that you can put on your TV of the Yule log. So it's just kind of funny how it's evolved a little bit, even in the last 10 years, that it's starting to become a tradition again. Now, if you recall at the beginning of this presentation, I spoke of one reason the celebration of Christmas kind of fell out of favor is because of the puritanical influences. And Christmas Day, I believe Washington Irving wrote to allay the fears of religious folks, saying, yeah, you can actually celebrate Christmas and it can be merry and it can be a good time while still, celebrating the birth of Jesus. Cranyon's Christmas Day starts with a service, a church service in which everyone in the home attends. Irving makes it a point to the little country church that they traveled to, that was decorated with greenery as well. Although there's a very funny scene where the parson or pastor has to have a talk with the sexton about he accidentally hung mistletoe within the church's green. But anyway, during this Christmas service, carols are sung, very joyous and not somber to what it was actually. And when the parson gives his sermon, Washington Irving actually writes the parson saying, quote, "The rites and ceremonies of Christmas and the propriety of observing it not merely as a day of thanksgiving, but of rejoicing, supporting the correctness of his opinions by the earliest usages of the church." And again, it's just a way to alleviate some of those puritanical influences. And it really did help make Christmas kind of the celebratory event that we know today. Now, later on in this essay, the squire of the estate opens his home for the less fortunate, for the residents in town. He gives folks food and drink, and that's something you'll see a lot in Charles Dickens' works as well. But let's move on. Speak of Dickens a little bit late. Christmas dinner. I don't really need to talk to you much about what Washington Irving wrote about in the Christmas dinner essay. It was Christmas dinner and having, folks coming from all over and partaking in this feast together. Now, one tradition that Washington Irving describes in this chapter, which I don't think is very well known to this day, but it was extremely popular after the book came out, even more so in the Victorian era, and that is the wassail bowl. Does anyone know wassail? Yeah. Yeah, some of you might think I'm speaking another language, but wassail was actually an old English tradition, and well, I wanted to look it up and see what the heck it was. So I actually found a modern recipe for it, and no, I'm not going to give you the amounts, but I will read it off just so you kind of get what it is. This actually comes from the City Tavern Cookbook, which is Old City Tavern in Philadelphia, which I think actually recently closed, but that was a colonial restaurant. So it's kind of the time period. So in wassail is red Burgundy wine, orange zest, lemon zest, cloves, cinnamon sticks, dark brown sugar, and grated nutmeg. Just to give you an idea of what that would taste like.
Blech.
I think pretty good.
And the tradition which Washington Irving wrote about was everyone gathering around the wassail bowl, getting a glass and toasting to the new year. Now, during this bit, I spoke of Washington Irving. I spoke of very tangible things that we can see today, but I can't stress this enough. In the United States, Washington Irving's biggest influence on Christmas was making it an observant holiday where you really went all out. You got together with family. Businesses should be closed. It should be a home holiday, and that's probably the biggest influence Washington Irving gave Christmas. Now, again, just to give you a little bit of context, very quickly, I'll just wrap up Washington Irving. He continued to have literary success, and his standings in the minds of Americans grew. Something people might not realize is President John Tyler actually appointed Irving minister to Spain, or today he would be ambassador. to Spain. So Irving died on November 28th, 1859. And fittingly enough, he's buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, a name synonymous with the man himself. Now, again, these essays were part of the larger book of the sketchbook of Geoffrey Cranyon. But in the 1880s and 90s, the book publisher put these essays together and combined them into one book simply entitled Old Christmas, which is where these engravings you've seen throughout the presentation, that's where they came from. So it's a relatively short read, under about 150 pages. So, well, I suggest you read it. Again, it's a nice quick read. You get a lot of context of Old English traditions. Again, some of them weren't really Old English traditions, some he just made up. But you can see really the influence it had on Christmas to this day. Well, let's move on to Charles Dickens now. Well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but many of you perhaps are more familiar with Charles Dickens than Washington Irving, which is acceptable. I will speak real quick. I spoke earlier of another literary battle going on. Well, I came across another one doing research for this, and that is this movement to really get Washington Irving the recognition for bringing back Christmas. In fact, there was one harshly op-ed piece that was entitled Charles Dickens, the Man Who Stole Christmas, which I think is a little harsh because Charles Dickens didn't go out of his way to, take the thunder, if you will, from Washington Irving. But it's very fascinating and a controversy I wasn't aware of at the time. But anyway, like in the United States, Christmas was waning in England at the time. Unlike the United States, Christmas had been celebrated in the past. I mean, during the Middle Ages, Christmas celebrations involved decorating homes, giving gifts, and overall merriment. This all changed when Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, there they are again, came to power in 1653. Laws were actually passed to prohibit churches from holding special Christmas services. The London shop owners were told to remain open, and soldiers actually patrolled the streets looking for anyone with any sort of Christmas revelry about them. So yes, this didn't last very long in the grand scheme of things of English history, but it really took the wind out of the sails of the celebration of Christmas. So this is where it all, started to go downhill, if you will. And well, I'll get into another reason in a second, but there's good old Charles Dickens. He was born February 7th, 1812 in Portsmouth, Hampshire, England. He was born into a working class family. Although his father made a livable wage, he squandered their money, which led to rising debt. In 1824, young Charles had to be pulled from school and began work in a factory, while his father went to debtor's prison. Now, the other reason why Christmas wasn't celebrated much in England was because the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. In England, employers didn't give their workers off any time for the holiday. And well, the working class were extremely poor, so there was no money or no energy to spend on celebrating Christmas. It also didn't help that child labor laws were virtually non-existent at that time. The ones who want to celebrate Christmas the most. And Dickens, in his writings, really made these conditions known. And you'll see that throughout many, many of Charles Dickens' works. But by 1843, Charles Dickens is already an accomplished author. He had written The Pickwick Papers, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, and A Tale of Two Cities. He was hard at work on his next novel, Chuzzlewit. That sounds like a good pronunciation for everyone. Okay, which were printed in monthly segments. And unfortunately, financially, that book was not going well. Dickens needed money to support his ever-growing family. And one day an idea came for a short Christmas story, which Dickens penned in only about a month. I believe I read he wrote this story in 6 weeks. He titled the story A Christmas Carol. At the time, Dickens was feuding with his publishers, so he had to finance the book himself. It became a massive hit with both critics and the general public. Actually, fellow author at the time, William Makepeace Thackeray, called it a national benefit, and to every man and woman who reads it, a personal kindness. Now, legend goes, while Dickens was writing this story, he would walk about the streets of London, so much so he would walk, one biographer estimated 15 to 20 miles in one day, just walking the streets of London, trying to figure out this story. John Forster, Dickens' biographer, stated he was absolutely enthralled with his work. Forster notes Dickens, quote, wept over it and laughed and wept again and excited himself to an extraordinary degree. Now, I'm sure everyone knows the story of A Christmas Carol, even if you haven't read it. I mean, I looked it up. There are over 100 adaptations in television and movies in the United States alone. Well, the story about a wealthy but miserable old cuss by the name of Ebenezer Scrooge and his redemption by 4 spirits, Jacob Marley, his business partner, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And woven within this story is the plight of the poor through the Cratchit family. Now, this presentation is only about Christmas, but very quickly, it's worth pointing out A Christmas Carol, as well as many of Dickens' works, was very influential on society itself in dealing with, the quote unquote poor laws, eventually getting rid of debtor's prison, that kind of thing. But really, I just want to focus on Christmas. Now, like Irving in Old Christmas, Dickens throughout the story portrays the observance of Christmas as a joyous holiday. Unlike Old Christmas, there aren't many examples of tangible traditions which emerge from A Christmas Carol. I mean, sure, at Fezziwig's party, there's lively dancing and the greens are all hung all about. And with the ghost of Christmas present at Scrooge's nephew's Fred's house, there's games being played. All became very popular pastimes at the Christmas season. Even the Cratchits had their big meal with the plum pudding, which is nothing like American pudding, just so you know. It's kind of a wet cake, if you will. But the main takeaway from the book, the central Christmas ideal, is one of celebration, generosity, and goodwill. And again, all three of those are still to this day notions which we associate with Christmas, and it can all be traced back to, especially generosity and goodwill, Charles Dickens, but even more so, Washington Irving. And yeah, there are some illustrations. A bit of a shameless plug, but if you come to the Emlyn Physic Estate, in the formal parlor, on the engraving on your left, you see the greens actually hanging down from the ceiling going to a central point, and that is something we actually replicated here at the Emlyn Physic Estate. But there's games being played and overall revelry. Now Dickens absolutely adored the holiday of Christmas. And he had a wonderful quote, which really sums up his contribution to the holiday, which was something he said himself, which is Christmas is, quote, a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of the whole long year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut up hearts freely and to think of other people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Now, this specific quote, over time, Dickens would actually call this his carol philosophy. And perhaps the longest lasting influence of Charles Dickens was he created a culture of generosity and giving to others. Still to this day, I'm sure I don't need to tell you all, many folks around Christmas time give charitable donations to various organizations. Now, who does that sound like? Well, if you know the story of A Christmas Carol, at the very end, Ebenezer Scrooge, when he's changed, goes up to a gentleman and gives him a very, very charitable donation. And the line, and there are many back payments in that, I assure you. So that is something, again, a little more difficult to wrap our heads around, because again, it's not tangible. It's an idea. It's a way of celebrating. Now, after A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens actually wrote 4 other Christmas stories. And that doesn't include any essays that he wrote. None, however, really obtained the lasting success or recognition of A Christmas Carol. His other stories include Cricket on the Hearth, The Chimes, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man. I actually just finished reading The Haunted Man last week. And many of these stories, although very different in plot and setting, well, first off, involve the supernatural with ghosts and other things like that, which the Victorians absolutely loved. But it's always, I shouldn't say always, many of these stories are very similar to Ebenezer Scrooge's, which is a story of redemption by someone who, well, wasn't very interested in the people and the society around him. But his short essay, Dickens' short essay, The Christmas Tree, did have a profound effect, and this is something very tangible. No, Dickens did not create the idea of Christmas trees. In fact, Queen Victoria's German husband, Prince Albert, brought the idea to Great Britain from the Germanic region. But Dickens wrote, again, A Christmas Tree, which is a very short essay, and it very much played to the nostalgia. And when arguably the most famous person in all of the country, writes about, oh, Christmas trees are wonderful, and Queen Victoria's husband has them, pretty much everyone in England wanted a Christmas tree after that. And thereby, folks in the United States, well, especially the 1850s and 1860s, we were wanted to be like the British. So a lot of those traditions carried over across the sea. One thing I'll just point out very quickly, if you look at the engraving on the left, the Christmas tree, notice how strange that looks. Like how there's various tiers of the tree with big gaps in the middle. That was actually how you wanted them back then, because you put candles on the tree. You don't really want to put candles near those greens because they will catch pretty quickly. So that's why there are massive holes between the various tiers. And it was really popular until people began growing Christmas trees differently to what they are today, where they're completely full in. People, they don't want holes in their Christmas tree anymore. Now, the fact that Dickens' other Christmas stories weren't as popular as A Christmas Carol didn't really seem to bother him, because Charles Dickens himself made an abridged version of A Christmas Carol where he would have public readings. And yes, Dickens would read the abridged version of the story. And, he would have several throughout the Christmas season. So he very much appreciated what he had done for the season of Christmas. Now, I will say before I go on too, I'm not saying that everything we do today can be attributed to Washington Irving or Charles Dickens, but again, they really brought it to the forefront of popular culture. And so much so that perhaps the most telling story of Dickens' connection with Christmas comes from his death in 1870. The story goes, when a girl in London heard of his passing, she exclaimed, "Dickens dead? Then will Father Christmas die too?" I mean, just to give you an idea of how interly connected Charles Dickens was, even at the time, with the Christmas celebration. Here's a little something too that I found throughout this research. Now, Charles Dickens and Washington Irving were actually good friends at one point. In January of 1842, Charles Dickens came for a tour of the United States. And during a speech in New York City, he explained the origins of their friendship. Quote, "There is in this city a gentleman who, at the reception of one of my books, I well remember it was the Old Curiosity Shop, wrote to me in England a letter so generous, so affectionate, and so manly, that if I had written the book under every circumstance of disappointment, of discouragement, and difficulty, instead of the reverse, I should have found in this receipt of that letter my best and most happy reward. I answered him, and he answered me, and so we kept shaking hands autographically, as if no ocean rolled between us." And when Dickens was over here, he spent a lot of time with Washington Irving in his his home along the Hudson. And okay, this has nothing to do with the presentation, but I just found this fascinating. Washington Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and in the book there's a party going on at the I believe the Van Tassel family home. It turns out the home that Washington Irving based the Van Tassel home from, Washington Irving ended up buying and living in the rest of his life. So it's just a neat little connection. But anyway, sorry, I got so worked up, I lost my place for a second. Yeah, here we go. Now, when Washington Irving was leaving for his position as minister to Spain, Dickens actually went to Washington, D.C. and saw him off. And Dickens wrote of their goodbye, quote, "Irving was with me at Washington yesterday and wept heartily at parting. He is a fine fellow." And the final letter, which exists between the two, Dickens wrote, "Wherever you go, God bless you. What pleasure I have had in seeing and talking with you. I will not attempt to say, as long as I live, I shall never forget the privilege of my association with you." And I just thought it very neat how these two authors, again, really credited with bringing back the celebration of Christmas, actually knew each other and, spent time together and spoke with one another. I mean, it's just a awesome little fact. Look at that. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation and come out of it with a better appreciation of Charles Dickens and Washington Irving. Now, as I said earlier, I highly recommend reading Old Christmas. And okay, well, really any of Dickens' Christmas books are great as well. As with Old Christmas, Dickens' books are relatively short as well. I mean, if they're not under 150 pages, they're close to it. I shouldn't have to say this, but if you haven't read A Christmas Carol yet, go and do that right now. I mean, don't even listen to my closing remarks. Just stop the thing and go read A Christmas Carol now. Both Old Christmas and a lot of Dickens' works fell out of copyright. They're in the public domain, so you can read them, a lot of them for free, especially with the electronic readers. Like I have a Amazon Kindle and I can download them. I will say, if you like the hard copies though of a book, at the Carriage House of the Emlyn Physic Estate, we do have A Christmas Carol, as well as Cricket on the Hearth, which again, I believe was Dickens' second Christmas book, but they're all worth reading. Now, before I take any questions, I do want to tell you that Mary Stewart will be presenting Christmas Traditions, Decking the Halls next week at this time. So I encourage you all to go and next week and listen to her wonderful presentation. I haven't even heard it, but I know Mary, so I can guarantee you it's going to be great. And with that, let me go back to the chat. Yeah, there I am again. Okay. Okay, good. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them or ask. I am by no means know everything about Washington Irving or Charles Dickens, but I really did learn a lot throughout this presentation. So if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them. But with that, again, thank you for coming out. We weren't sure how this was going to go, doing a Zoom lunch and learn, but I'm glad so many of you showed up. And again, there's one next week, and look for this winter. We'll be doing a few over Zoom as well. So with that, I hope everyone has a great holiday, and I'll stay on for a little bit in case you want to speak with me. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everybody. This is Jody. I'm the director of MAC, and I want to thank Ben for a great lunch and learn presentation today. Very timely. I want to thank you all for your participation and in taking time out of your day to take part in it. And I also want to thank Ben for recently stepping up to assume the responsibility to coordinate our museum education effort. And so this is a nice introduction for many of you who might not have met Ben before. He has done some lunch and learns and other interactive type presentations, but it's a good opportunity for you all to get to know Ben a little bit better. Today is Ben's daughter's first birthday, Abigail's first birthday. So let's all wish her a happy birthday. And he's with us and not with her.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ben, and thank you for your family with sharing you with us today.
Yeah.
And then just one comment. I don't know if you've seen, it's a movie, it's only about 3 years old. It's called The Man Who Invented Christmas.
Mhm.
It's kind of quasi-biographical about Dickens as he was writing A Christmas Carol and some of the pressures that he was having, including writer's block and things of that nature, and some of the influences on him, as Ben touched upon. So if you have some time over the holidays, it's free on Netflix, I think. And it's definitely worth the watch. Also really interesting about his relationship with his father. And it does touch upon his father being someone who did have a problem with keeping money in a bank or a wallet. So,
Yeah, and that movie is based on a book of the same title.
Right.
So, yeah. So yeah, hopefully I gave you some reading material for the rest of the month. Again, there's various places to find these things. So yeah, they should be easy to find. Should be, not guaranteeing it, but should be. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.